Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt at Studio North. I read this book on my drive north when the fetching Mrs. Hewitt was driving. The Age of Grievance by Frank Bruni. Frank has been on the show before. The Age of Grievance follows his appearance here a few years ago when he wrote, "Where you go is not who you will be." Miss Hewitt loves The Beauty of Dusk. I haven't read that one, but Frank Bruni is back. Welcome, Frank. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Frank, I want to start by saying it's a fabulous book. It's very provocative. I agree with a lot of it. I disagree with a lot of it, but I got to show you something. I read books when I'm going to do an interview by making page notes at the end, and I don't think I've ever hit 7 pages of endnotes. So I'd like to compliment whoever your publisher is for including a lot of places in the back where people like me and other interviewers can make their notes about the interview. 7 pages of endnotes. This could go on a while, Frank, because the Age of Grievance is very provocative. Have you heard that from other people?
Provocative, I don't know, thought provoking, maybe. I like that better.
Well, there, I'll go with that. I will go with thought
Okay.
provoking. Before I go to the hard stuff and the interesting stuff and the stuff on which we agree and disagree, though, I want to begin with the fun stuff or I'll forget it. Um, you stood out all night at the Hartford Civic Center for tickets to Queen.
I did when I was 13 or 14, I did. But back then, you'll remember, you couldn't go online as you can with a Taylor Swift concert and just, if you're willing to fork over $10,000, get in the second row. It was a sort of more egalitarian age, maybe. And the way you got the best seats was to show up at the box office in the middle of the night, which I did.
This is one of the small paragraphs in a eminently readable book that I think I'm not going to forget. You're right. It used to be egalitarian. You got tickets if you worked hard at it. I called my son up after I read about Iron Man XC. He's an Iron Man this summer, and he's done these things before, a triathlon. And I said, "Have you ever heard of this?" He said, "No, but there are a lot of jerks in our community." Tell people about that, Frank, because I thought, like the tickets, like Taylor Swift, that was illustrative of the two nations that we have now.
No, I'm really glad you brought that up. We have created a service economy with all of these tiers, tiers upon tiers upon tiers, that allow people not only kind of to indulge themselves to whatever extent they like, but to flaunt their degree of coddling over everyone else. Iron Man XC is this bizarre thing because you would think Iron Man, it connotes like I'm rough, I'm tough, I can do the hard stuff. Iron Man XC is you pay an extra amount and you get like a hotel that's closer to the start line. You get like a personal trainer. You get a fridge stocked just the way you want it. And I write about it because it almost seems like a satire of our economy, but it's also emblematic of what I refer to in the book as all of these microclimates of privilege, these microclimates of exclusivity that we've developed, and that I think are really potent engines of envy in our economy and are part of the explanation for what has driven us so far apart.
And this is one of our agreements. I want to use an example with which you may not be familiar unless you're a Disneyland goer. The last time we went to Disneyland with grandchildren, my wife was very upset. They've instituted a new thing in Disneyland. You can now buy your way to the front of the line inside of Disneyland. It's astonishing to me. It used to be part of the Disneyland experience when I was a kid for the first time, is that you stood in line forever everywhere. Have you ever been, Frank?
I have been, and I have a bunch of nieces and nephews, and I'm familiar with that. I think that one's called the Genie Pass. But every
Yes.
amusement park I have been, yeah, every amusement park I've been to over the past decade has had this sort of ability to essentially do in the amusement park what we do on the airplane, to kind of get in the front, get the amusement park equivalent of overhead baggage space before everybody else fills it up. And again, I think these things just really drive a wedge between people of different classes, create a great deal of animosity, and I'm not sure why we went down this road, but I wish we'd put some brakes on.
Well, it's the ability of technology to maximize revenue by pricing according to demand. So the Adam Smith in me, and there's a lot of it, says this is the invisible hand at work, but the American in me says this is not how we do things here. If you go out for the football team, we don't reserve 10 spots for the kids who want to buy their way onto the playing field. You got to earn your way on the playing field. And this is, I hate this word, systemic in America because technology has allowed us to maximize profit, right?
Absolutely. But we used to have, and maybe technology is going to undermine this entirely, but we used to have a sort of set of ethics and a sense of decency that prevented us from going too far. I've had people ask me, in terms of what we're talking about now and this portion of the book, if I think government should step in and say, no, you can't do this, you can't do a genie pass, you can't do levels of coddling this ridiculous. And I don't think that. I don't think that would work. I'm not
Good.
arguing for a bigger government in this regard. I'm asking all of us to kind of look inside um, and to ask ourselves the question about whether our behavior, especially when it comes to flaunting our privilege, and especially when it comes to the way we do so on social media and use social media, whether that's good for our civic culture or whether, if we're honest with ourselves, we can see how it's degraded us.
The Age of Grievance is Frank's book. I'm going to continue to talk to him as the show concludes and play it for you tomorrow morning and throughout the week. But go get The Age of Grievance. You will have your thought provoked. You won't agree with all of it. You just won't. You're a You Do It listener. But you'll be glad you did read Frank Bruni's new The Age of Grievance. And all of this will be on today's pod, and it will be played throughout the week on the You Do It show. Thank you all for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow on the next live You Do It show. Welcome back, America. I've got Frank Bruni with me. I began the conversation on Monday's program live about his brand new book, The Age of Grievance, and I got the fun stuff out of the way. I was tempted to begin, Frank, but we wouldn't have gotten to the key stuff for the first bit with the fact that Duke, which was praised by Dan Senor to you when I heard you talking with Dan Senor on Call Me Back, as sort of a refuge from the anti Semitism, had that broken over the weekend. Were you at commencement when the students walked out?
I was not a commencement, but I talked to several people who were there. And yes, as has happened at many campuses, Duke had a student protest, specifically of Jerry Seinfeld as the commencement speaker because he has been so supportive of Israel. And so, yeah, this has touched even Duke. It was a fairly limited number of students who walked out. It was a disruption that didn't last that long. So, Dan's point, and by the way, Dan was speaking in part as someone who'd been down here and done an event at Duke that I moderated. I interviewed him on stage. His point about the temperature of the Duke campus being a bit cooler and more measured remains. But yeah, I mean, these protests, this disagreement over the war in Gaza, there are few corners of American society that are entirely untouched by it.
A couple of people I will look forward to having talking to in the future and getting their reaction. Chris Bale, I had not heard of until I read The Age of Grievance. He comes up a couple of times. First of all, he thinks the problem of the echo chamber is massively overstated. He's a professor at Duke, but he also runs something called the Polarization Lab at Duke. Tell us about Chris Bale and how you agree and disagree with him, Frank Bruni.
Well, I agree, first of all, with his set of concerns and his overall effort, as I'm sure you do. We are a perilously polarized country right now. Our partisanship has gone from negative partisanship to what I think of almost as apocalyptic partisanship. And I love the fact that Chris is trying to study that in an academically rigorous way and figure out what we might do to push back at that. He does not believe that echo chambers are as big or consequential a phenomenon as I do and many others do. And he makes a good argument for that, but there's a good counter argument. And I would recommend to your listeners a terrific piece that ran about a year and a half ago in the New Yorker that essentially pitted Chris Bale against Jonathan Haidt. And each of them was arguing their perspective. Jonathan Haidt, as you know, recently wrote The Anxious Generation, believes that social media has had an even more destructive effect on our society, on our discourse, on our young people than we acknowledge. Chris Bale thinks we lay a lot of problems at the feet of social media, and some of them belong there and some don't. What is especially interesting about Chris is he is trying to research and develop social media platforms that would operate with different incentive structures, where the angriest post, the most ideologically fixed and certain post, wouldn't be the one that rises to the top, wouldn't be what the platform surfaces, but maybe there would be a different kind of algorithm that privileged and prized consensus. Now, I don't know if there'd be a marketplace for that, but I'd sure as hell like to find out, wouldn't you?
You know, Frank, Jonathan was on the program when The Anxious Generation came out because I inhaled it. I've told everyone to read about it. My daughter is reading it. We're going to do a broadcast because she has four children. She's trying to figure out how to introduce them to media as they get to that age. And I said, read Jonathan because he's absolutely on point here. He's another man of the left with whom I will occasionally agree. So I think maybe Chris Bale might be like the fellow on the shore when the tsunami's coming in, who sees the water rise and isn't worried. I think the tsunami is going to hit and it's going to be worse than we think. But I will talk with him about that when the time comes. In your book, The Age of Grievance, you write, and I want to make sure I get this, it's on page 139 if you're taking notes at home. You cite a column that you wrote 3 years ago in June of 2021 about the degree to which journalists, opinion writers, especially, have contributed to the toxic tenor of American discourse. In your book, a couple of people come in for some harsh treatment. One of them is my friend Charlie Kirk, another is my friend Mark Levin. I know that they don't do radio the way I do, but I think they are fundamentally open to having anyone from the left come on, but the people on the left won't come on, Frank. I think this is particularly the problem with Mark Levin, who is a constitutional lawyer. I mean, he was chief of staff to the Attorney General of the United States. Mark is a very smart guy. He used to be a litigator before he got into media, and Democrats won't go near him. This is part of the problem in our culture is that some people are off limits to Democrats. They don't want to argue their case.
I'm not sure I agree with you in every particular, but I agree with you in general. What you just said, I for the most part agree with. I like it, I salute it, and I praise and celebrate it when I see, for example, Ro Khanna go on Fox News. When I see Pete Buttigieg go on Fox News, I think it's important, and I compliment you on this. You and I don't see eye to eye politically. There are things we do agree on, as you said. Um, but I think it's really important that we talk to one another and that we do it respectfully, and that when we disagree on something, we are willing to have that conversation with one another because it serves nobody's interest for us to retreat into our corners and just scream at one another. I do wish more Democrats would speak to more Republicans and vice versa, because I think a big part of the problem is this sort of black white good, evil, villain, victim binary that so many people put on their politics. It is antithetical to compromise, which I do not see as a dirty word. I see it as a virtue. It is antithetical to common ground, which is the only way we get anything accomplished in this country. And so I'm delighted. I've done a bunch of interviews for this book, and I'm especially delighted to be doing this one. And I respect the fact that you invited me because A, it shows people that there is plenty of Venn diagram overlap of agreement among people who technically exist on separate points of the political spectrum. But I think it also models the kind of discourse that will serve our country.
Now, that kind of discourse used to be common. You wrote about it in The Age of Grievance, that it used to be that we did not know the politics of our anchors, and it used to be that programs were down the middle. That's gone now. Fox News gets beat up here. You do throw a few punches at MSNBC as well, so I'm glad to see that in the course of The Age of Grievance. I'm not interested in who struck John. I'm interested in how to reclaim. Now, this program, I've hosted Secretary Clinton after the election. She came on for a long conversation about a book, What Happened, and she said, you know, I should have been doing this beforehand. I've hosted John Kerry and Jim Clapper. Roe is a friend of mine. Every Democrat you mentioned in this book has been invited on this program. People like Gavin, the Governor Newsom, say, oh, I'll come on, I'll come on, I'll come on, and then they don't. Pete Buttigieg comes on once, checks the box, and doesn't come back. How do we fix this, Frank? Because until and unless both parties, and I see Senator Cotton on with Margaret Brennan yesterday, arguing with Margaret, which is her right, but I don't see Democrats going to argue with me when they're in office. Do you? Do you see it anywhere?
Um, I probably don't consume as much media as you do, honestly, but I do agree with you that it doesn't happen as often as it should. I can't quantify it. How do we fix it? I don't know. Those of us who feel differently and believe that there's a better way, we live what we're saying. We go on the programs. We have the conversations. I think there's evidence that voters will reward that. But I think there are aspects of our politics right now, from the primary system on to other facets of our politics, that don't um, let the consensus builders come to the fore in the way I would like to see, and I'm guessing you would like to see.
Well, let me now bring up a point of disagreement. I don't think gerrymandering is ever going away. Again, Adam Smith works in politics, and gerrymandering has been around since the Reform Bill of 1834 began to be fix the rotten boroughs of England. It's never going anywhere, and I can bring up California, Massachusetts, and Illinois as blue gerrymandered states, and you can bring up Texas and Florida and Ohio and North Carolina as red gerrymandered states. It's just built into the system. I don't want to change that. I do, however, want people to be able to hear from our leaders. And our leaders don't do a lot of media, Frank. And by media, I mean long form, Brian over at C SPAN, me, anywhere. I don't see President Biden sitting for longer than 14 minutes with Aaron Burnett. Is that a failure of the presidency to engage with everybody left, right, and center at length?
President Biden needs to engage much more than he has. You will get no argument from me there. I think um, the media access to him, the amount he's allowed, is not acceptable. Um, it does not allow for as much transparency as we deserve in our leaders. It does not allow for us to understand the full range of what he's thinking and plans to do to the extent that we're entitled to. I couldn't agree with you more. I do want to say something, though, as a representative of the media. Um, we bear some blame here. I think, and this is not about President Biden, what I'm about to say, but I think politicians, many politicians, are reluctant to sit down with us, not because they're hiding something or trying to hide something, but because they have seen and in some cases too often been burned um, by our selective edits of what they say, by our kind of emphasizing a gaffe or a provocative statement versus the whole of an interview. And I think we should take a look in the mirror and do a little bit of soul searching about that as we correctly say, hey, you need to talk to us because we're your conduit to voters. Voters need to understand you as well as possible. Because if we believe in democracy and if we believe in letting the people decide, then we need to give the people as much information as possible.
Frank, what do you think about the great debate over fact checking a public figure in real time? Now, I've talked about this. I've interviewed former President Trump probably more than anyone else in broadcast media, beginning in 2015 to the present, more than 2 dozen times. And my view is let him talk. And if you've got something to argue with, make sure he's taking a breath when you argue with it or you deflect it. Other people interrupt him all the time because they want to fact check him because of their imperative within their news organizations. I believe in letting people speak their piece and then coming back. How do you handle that?
Um, because I write commentary and because I'm usually not writing breaking news and that sort of thing, I'm not, that challenge doesn't come to me. Um, I'm not doing a lot of interview based stories. I'm certainly not doing a lot of real time interviews. So I don't have to face that. I think fact checking is vital. I think it's absolutely crucial. I think the media has to do it. Whether it happens in between sentences or 5 minutes later, I'm not sure that matters quite as much to me as it does to other people, as long as it happens. Um, and the problem, and I think you put your finger on this, Donald Trump gives interviews. He spouts a gazillion falsehoods, and so I don't think there's any kind of moral wrong in, say, Caitlin Collins interrupting him and saying but. But if the goal is to inform people and to make them the smartest voters possible, the rhythm of that sort of thing becomes so distracting and becomes so polarizing that while I think it is done in some senses on the side of the angels, I don't know that it has the effect that it's intended. And I certainly don't think it kind of cools the temperature at all. And one of the reasons, and I'm so flattered you read my book, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, and you can tell me whether I accomplished this or not, is I feel like so much that gets written and said in the political space is an attempt to exploit the already hot temperature and raise it further. And I would like to see more books, more commentary that try to lower the temperature because we're at a boiling point constantly in this country. It's part of what you see on college campuses. Um, and I don't think we need to turn the stove up, turn the burners up any higher than they already are.
Uh, Agree, disagree. I agree on that generally. We are in the political season of the 6 months prior to a presidential. I've been doing this show since 2000, Frank, and I've been on the air since 1990. And I've been doing journalism a little bit longer than you, I think. And I realize that the 6 months before a presidential election are the time when we are least likely to turn down the heat. But immediately thereafter, we do, or at least we used to. Technology is my greatest. You target technology in the online world quite a lot in the age of grievance, but not nearly as much as I would, because it seems to me that at the intersection of technology and political angst is the moment in which we are living. And unless people get off of this stuff or learn how to go in harm's way of opposing opinions, it's only going to get worse. And I am afraid it's going to get worse. We're also in the middle of a war, and this war doesn't allow for a lot of nuance, does it?
Nothing in American life or political discourse right now allows for a lot of nuance. You mentioned earlier that I teach at Duke, and I do, and I've had a better experience with students than the caricature of them in the media would suggest that one might. But that may also be about Duke being a different environment than, say, Columbia or Yale or Brown. But I say to every student at the beginning of the semester, in just about every course, if not every course, I say, you're going to hear me say a couple of words more frequently than any others. And those words are going to be, it's complicated. Because I stand before you not as a merchant of certitude, but as an ambassador of doubt. We need in our political debates when something, the October 7th massacre and everything since is an example, we need not to immediately decide what our unwavering and pure position is. But we need to kind of take in information. We need to acknowledge shades of gray. We need to be able to see and talk about moral complexity. And I see that vanishing completely from American life. And I think that's a big part of our political dysfunction.
I was very interested in your teaching anecdotes. I've been teaching con law since 1996 at Chapman Law School in Orange County. Chapman University, very elite undergraduate, very selective undergraduate. The law school is rising in the rankings, but it will take 50 years till it gets into the securely into the top tier. But I've been teaching since 1996 there. And law school is different from undergrads, Frank, because in law school, they got to learn the law or they're not going to pass the bar. So they're much more attuned. But my favorite phrase is you're going to hear, and I say it in the first day of class, you're going to get frustrated because I'm going to tell you on the one hand and on the other hand, because you got to know both the majority and the dissent. And if you don't know the argument, you're not going to pass the bar. So they pay attention to it. I'm not sure how it would go over with undergraduates to do on the one hand and on the other hand. How does it work in your class?
I have had a fairly good experience with it, but I mean, and I say this not cynically, but just to be perfectly honest, um, what do most students at elite universities like Duke University want? They want to get an A. They want to please the teacher. You can use that leverage in many different ways. And I send the signal at the beginning of a semester that I want you to accept ideological diversity. I want you to honor it in your classmates to the extent that it exists, and sometimes not enough of it does exist. Um, I want you to kind of play with uncomfortable notions, color outside the lines of your pre-existing beliefs. And since students ultimately want to succeed in a class, want to please the professor, many of them move in that direction. I share that because I think those of us who teach, you, me, our colleagues, I think we have the ability, if we have the right motivation and if we define certain values, and one of my values is open and respectful discourse, I think we can point and nudge students more in that direction than they are often being pointed and nudged in academia today. So I've had a mostly positive experience. Now, I will say there are certain prisms that this generation of students, the ones at elite universities, use for too many things. And I write about this in the book, and I'm sure you remember this because I'm sure it resonated. I had a class where we were talking about various things that have changed over time. And I was asking my students why they thought at that moment in time the numbers on abortion hadn't changed much in the Republican Party, but the numbers on marriage equality, on same sex marriage, had changed a lot. And a student raised her hand and she said, I know the answer for that. And I said, what's the answer? And she said, white supremacy, which kind of shows you the currency of that phrase. And I said, explain to me how white supremacy explains this. And she said, well, more white women get abortions, and so Republicans oppose abortion because they're worried about the white race dying out. And I had to
And let
say
me
to her,
interject here because I was struck, Frank. She was gobsmacked by the truth. Now tell the audience the truth about that.
The tr- the truth is, at least, I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers in the last couple of months, but the truth is, at that point in time, that was about 3 years ago. I think black women were 4 times more likely, per capita wise, to have abortions. And I told her that, and she looked at me like I just said I had stood in line at the student cafeteria behind Bigfoot, right? So there is this sort of facile, voguish thinking along certain lines that does happen among this generation of students, especially at the elite universities. So I want to be really honest about that. That said, I have had much more success than people would assume bringing diverse voices into the classroom. I teach an opinion writing class with some frequency. I brought Kevin Williamson in by Zoom to talk to the students. I said, you're going to disagree with a lot of what he says. When you read up on him, as you must, that's a requirement when someone comes as a guest speaker by Zoom or in person. You're not going to like some of what you're going to read, but he's a brilliant writer and he has stuff to teach you. And I think you should be exposed to his thinking. He came, he Zoomed, they listened, he left. Nobody complained to the dean. I wasn't canceled. I sit before you in one piece today. It is possible.
Oh, it is. And I have gone through, I don't know, 1996 to the present, almost 30 years with one complaint. People thought I was too hard on the Mormons because I always call on LDS missionaries on the first day of class because in law school you have to engage at Socratic. And the LDS missionaries are never phased because they spent 2 years knocking on doors in some remote area of some remote city, and they just are unfazed. And some student thought I was picking on the Mormons, and I wasn't. Let me go back here and talk to you about the uh, the divide in America because it's very deep, it's very real. Yesterday, Donald Trump, or 2 days ago, Donald Trump had 100,000 people at a racetrack in New Jersey. Frank, if those 100,000 people read The Age of Grievance, I think a lot of them might say, you don't know me, Frank Bruni. But it seems to me your upbringing, you do know them. You're just not talking about them much, or you're not very sympathetic to them right here. What would you say to them? Because I'm from Warren, Ohio, part of the burnt over area, the deindustrialized Middle West, where all the steel mills are closed and the car manufacturers have left, and there's a lot of fentanyl and there's a lot of crime, and there isn't a lot of economic opportunity, which is the difference between the 60s and the 50s and today. What do you think those people who went to the Trump rally are there for?
Well, I mean, I don't know those people in particular, and it's interesting because you said 100,000, and there's a huge debate right now for the last 24 hours about that crowd size. And I shy away as a journalist to talk about crowd size because it is it is one of the most kind of thankless, impossible things. Nobody has a good
Agree.
count or anything
Let's say
like that.
tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a lot of support for Donald Trump. And certainly, I mean, you mentioned fentanyl, you mentioned sections of the country. I completely understand why so many of them feel strongly about Trump and why so many of them feel overlooked and forgotten by the federal government. Um, because we have whole swaths of the country that have been devastated by the flight of manufacturing jobs, that have been devastated uh, by drugs and that sort of thing. And I think sometimes the Democratic Party in general, this isn't true Democrat to Democrat, has done has done a woeful, shameful job of recognizing that pain and moving to address it. But what I would also say, and this is kind of the whole point of my book, The Age of Grievance, is there are legitimate grievances. In fact, this is a country born of grievance, right? And then there are matters that follow those legitimate grievances to such extents, to such lengths, um, that they enter the realm of the illegitimate. They end up landing us and the people who are pressing those grievances in very dangerous places. It is one thing to believe that Donald Trump hears you in a way that Joe Biden and some other Democrat doesn't. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think Joe Biden hears those people as loudly as Donald Trump does. I think Donald Trump just does a better performance. That's just my opinion. But it is quite another thing to storm the Capitol on January 6th. And that's what I would say.
I wasn't going to bring up January 6th until the end because that is where you and I mostly disagree. Not in what has happened to the rioters. I wanted them all prosecuted. I was denouncing it during its happening. I was urging the president online, get online and stop this. Didn't mind the rally beforehand. That's just America. Didn't mind the march to the Capitol. Everyone who went into the Capitol needed to be prosecuted and has been. I don't call it an insurrection. I originally did, but now I call it a riot because I think it was a riot. I just think way too much emphasis has been put on those 1,000 people at the expense of the 75 million who voted for Donald Trump. That's our big disagreement. Let me go to
Well,
our
can
agreement.
I ask you
Please.
something about that? No, because I
Sure.
really I want to understand better. How do you feel then about Donald Trump using what are they called, the January 6th choir at his rallies? How do you feel about him saying that he's considering pardoning them and they are the truest patriots imaginable? How do you feel about all that?
I don't feel good about it, and I would advise him not to play the anthem. And I would advise him that while he may want to commute some sentences for people who apparently are unknowing violators of trespass law, and ignorance of the law is not an excuse. I've been a hard-nosed rule of law guy forever. They all needed to be prosecuted. Some of them deserved much lighter sentences than they got, and I believe the Supreme Court is going to reverse the statute under which they were prosecuted, many of them, and they've already served the time. It was a dark day, Frank. But how do you feel? And this is not in your book, and this is my big disagreement with your book. The J6 committee was a fraud. And Liz Cheney and I have discussed this at length in text. I won't talk to Adam Kinzinger. It was a it was a scar on the American Congress, the first time in almost 200 years that there have been committees that the minority party did not select its participants and that the Speaker of the House vetoed its chair. Its chair would have been Jim Banks, who is about to be elected overwhelmingly senator in Indiana, who is a Navy man, served a year in his country in Afghanistan, but Nancy Pelosi would not let him sit on the J6 committee, and the Republican, it was a show trial. I don't put any merit in that committee at all, zero zip, because it wasn't the adversarial process, which is deep in our bones. That's my biggest disagreement with you. How do you respond to that?
I thought the January 6th committee did important work. I understand what you're saying. Um, I don't think the Republican Party wanted to participate particularly meaningfully in that. I do feel that we learned some very important things in that committee's work. Um, I'm troubled. I'm troubled, and I do write about this in the book by some of the response among Republicans in the Republican Party to that committee. Um, Rather than, I mean, you just mounted a different kind of counter argument or defense or whatever. I don't, forgive my verbiage. um, a lot of what I read in response to the January 6th committee and some publications, for lack of a better word, on the right, was this is really just about insulting you. This is about a bunch of elites telling you how little they think of you. I don't think that is I don't think that was the takeaway in the narrative. And it's an example to me of something that happens across the political spectrum, which is if you don't like what someone is saying, you have an entirely different conversation. And that happens across the political spectrum. I feel the events of January 6th were meaningful. I think they warranted the kind of close look that the committee gave it. I think the committee didn't reflect people from both parties because I'm not sure that the Republicans who would have sat on it um, would have been open to the fact finding that happened. But this is, as you said, one of these areas where we disagree.
So let's go up from where we disagree on to a question of actual question. How big? I've had Tim Alberta on his book, the Power and the Glory. He and I disagree, and so you and I are probably going to disagree. But I don't anticipate questions for people. How big of a problem do you think so-called Christian nationalism is?
I this is where I sometimes am a very terrible pundit. I do not know. And when I write about it very briefly in the book, I'm brief about it because I do not feel well versed enough, informed enough, and above all, and I write about this in the book too. Um, when I hear people, when I see writers using the phrase Christian nationalism, Christian nationalist, often they mean very different things. And right now, I think the definition of it as it's applied to various things on our political landscape, I am finding kind of ambiguous and imprecise, and it puts me at a loss to speak with any confidence and real insight and knowledge about it. And I do want, I do want to be, if I'm going to be lumped in, if I'm going to be a pundit or whatever the right phrase is, I do want to be one who kind of says on this subject, I don't feel I have enough insight or authority to speak with any certainty.
There you are living out one of the constructive suggestions at the end. The media needs more humility. And I agree with you. I don't know how big it is either, but I know when people overstate it. And my pastor in Virginia is a Democrat, and our congregation is 50% Democrat, 40% Republican, 10% undecided. And I like to talk to my Democratic friends. My roommates in college, one of them was Bill Clinton's director of communications, Peace Corps director. The other was Barack Obama's deputy secretary of energy. My generation grew up arguing with civility and passion. The question is, what happened to the civility? That's really the biggest question, Frank. And you talk about social media some, but not John Haidt talks about it all the time. I think civility was killed by the internet, and I don't know that it can come back with the internet. What do you say to that?
I think I agree with you on all of that. The only reason that social media, which is gets a big chunk of my book, the only reason it doesn't get more um, is because so much great stuff has been written about it. I don't think you can write about the age of grievance without taking pretty thorough stock of social media. But I also wanted to touch on so many other things um, because I think social media is this catalyst. Uh, but there's stuff that it catalyzes. We haven't talked about something that I think doesn't get enough attention, and I give it a chapter of my book. And in fact, when I was writing it, it was the chapter I felt most passionate about, it's the chapter I like most to this day, in the Atlantic excerpt of this, which is I think we're living in a pessimistic age in a way we didn't before. There's this whole new American pessimism. The once durable idea that your children would do better than you would. It used to be fairly reliable that a majority of Americans would say in surveys, I expect my children to have a better life than I have. No longer do you have a majority of Americans say that. No longer do you have a majority of Americans who are confident in an American future that exceeds even the American past. And I think that's an enormous part of the problem. Maybe, I mean, not maybe quite as bad as social media, but right up there. Because if you don't believe in the possibility of growth, if you don't believe in the possibility of fairness, if you don't believe that the pie is expanding or might expand, you have a completely different relationship to your slice of it. And you feel like you are in competition with your fellow Americans in what is a zero sum game. And that breeds envy, hostility, enmity, and hostility to a degree that I don't recall from decades ago, in part because I think we were a more hopeful, optimistic people in the past. But I'd be very curious for your take on that.
Well, I want to come back to that. I'll give you my take on that. I think the most important anecdote in your book, and I wanted to make sure I get to it, is your gas station encounter. I've had two of those, Frank. Both of them occurred after Donald Trump's election. The day after Donald Trump's election, a random stranger, I had been anchoring with NBC that night. I was working for NBC at the time with James Carville and Chuck Todd and Tom Brokaw and Lester and Savannah. And I was standing on a corner at about 10 o'clock the next morning, and a rando Manhattanite came up and started screaming at me, "You did this, you did this." The same thing happened to me on the tarmac in Aspen. Both individuals were relatively young men in their 30s. I'm in my 60s. Both of them screaming at the top of their lungs in Aspen, "You're not welcome here. We don't have your kind in this city." I was going to the Aspen Institute of Defense Security. And and you had this gas station encounter, which is worse than either of those because you were actually in physical fear. I was just taken aback. When did that start? I mean, I've been getting death threats since I went on the air. Literally, the first week I went on the air, I got a death threat, and so that's in 1990. I'm used to that stuff, but I have not. I am not used to being yelled at in public. When did that start?
I don't know when it started. I can't pinpoint it, but you have definitely correctly recognized that there is a coarseness and a cruelty and an aggression um, in American life right now that the stories you just shared illustrate, and that the person who approached me at a gas station because I was
Would
wearing
you
a
unpack that
mask.
story for people who haven't read the book, Frank? Can you retell that story for people who haven't read
Absolutely,
The Age
absolutely.
of Grievance?
It was very early on in the coronavirus pandemic. It was at a moment when we were still being told by authorities um, that if we were going to be outside in close proximity to other people, we should probably wear a mask, right? Now, I didn't in real time unpack or research critically the science, but I just kind of thought if that is possibly the best the best way to kind of prevent the spread of this, um, I'm going to err on the side of caution and courtesy. And so I pulled into a gas station on the Merritt Parkway, which, as anyone who's driven it knows, is very slender. There's not a lot of extra space, and that's true as well of the service stations to the side of it. And I got out to fill my rental car with gas. And I put on a mask because if other people were going to pull up, those pumps are packed really closely together. And I thought, this is the current advice. This is the root of etiquette and courtesy, and how much trouble is it really for me to put on this mask? And this young man began screaming at me and striding toward me, and saying, "You are the reason why we have no freedom. You are the problem." He was using curse words. And I looked up, and I'm just giving you the straight reporting. He seemed to be walking from a pickup truck with MAGA regalia and that sort of thing. Now, it is one thing for people to have differences of opinion. It is one thing to feel, as he must have, that I didn't need to be wearing that mask, and that he wasn't going to wear a mask. But why you have to pick a fight about it and try to turn it into an almost violent encounter? Why those people screamed at you in the stories you just told? I don't believe in screaming. I don't believe in canceling. I just don't think anything is served by that. And I also kind of believe in in basic human decency. And there is a coarseness in our life that is pushing that to the side. We have gone from road rage to air rage to restaurant rage to retail rage. Something has happened where people feel they confuse confrontation with conviction, they confuse provocation with principle. Um, and I don't know how we get back from it, but by God, we've really got to try to.
Uh, Missing from your book is any discussion of faith. Now, I'm curious, I'd like you to tell us what your faith orientation is, and my argument that a lot of what ails America is the withdrawal of faith from I think it's probably close to half the population now. I mean, a really vibrant belief system, whether it is Christianity, Catholic or Protestant, whether it is um, the uh, Jewish community, whether it's Reformed or Orthodox or ultra Orthodox or Hasidic, whether it is the Muslim community. I did Searching for God in America in 1996 for PBS. Everyone was curious in everyone else's point of view on religion at that point. That's not the case anymore. Why are you a person of faith and you didn't deal much with faith in The Age of Grievance? Actually, I didn't deal with it at all. What do you make of my
It's a
proposition?
Well, first of all, it's a very astute observation. I don't deal with faith head on. But what I would say to you is, I actually think I deal with faith in between the lines and in the margins, and I don't mean in some sort of cheeky or sly way. I talk toward the end of the book in particular when I'm talking about humility and seeing yourself not at the center of the universe and not believing everything should be tailored to your liking and should kind of reflect what you think. When I talk about how we've become more isolated, the whole bowling alone phenomenon by which um, community groups, not as many people belong to community groups, neighborhood associations. I think I do mention religious organizations in that sense.
Yes.
Um, I think that the faith component of this is important in the sense that I think faith represents a sense of belonging, a sense of teamwork and a universe that is bigger than you are, a sense of the human project as being collaborative rather than competitive. I think at their best, religious organizations have encouraged all of that. At their best, civic organizations have encouraged all of that. At their best, educational institutions, which have to some degree lost their way, encouraged all of that. And so I do believe that we need to see ourselves as part of something bigger, and we need to behave that way. I do not belong to any organized religion. Um, I would not call myself an atheist. I guess I'm an agnostic, but I believe very, very much in many of the principles that the Judeo-Christian denominations teach, and I believe many people have benefited from their faith lives and their faith organizations in a way that pushes back against grievance.
I agree with you on that. I'm not going to explain it to you right now. I'm an evangelical Roman Catholic Presbyterian. It's complicated, but I still go to confession. The most significant, it's complicated, that's your answer. The most significant penance I've ever been assigned in confession is something called the Litany of Humility. And I don't know
Mm.
that you've ever read it or looked it up, but if you Google the Litany of Humility, Frank, you will find it fabulous. Now let's go on to an area of agreement. When did we lose grammar? And I have three children, and the boys more than the girls, but one's in the Navy, one's on the Hill. I've got a son, a son-in-law, and a nephew on active duty in the Navy. So I'm one of those families, although I'm a civilian, that understands that our wars are fought by a very small group of people. But both boys say me and Joe, me and Susan, me and whatever. It drives me crazy. I've corrected them both at least 5,000 times. You talk about you're the grammar police in your class. What happened to grammar?
I think a couple of things happened, and thank you for bringing it up because it's a pet peeve of mine too. And I'm guessing, I don't want to speak for you, but for me, it's not just being a curmudgeon or a traditionalist. I think it's important um, to kind of, this isn't exactly the right verb, but to kind of submit to certain ways of doing things as a gesture of humility. Um, and especially when like there's no cost to doing so. I feel like what's happened to grammar is we have an entire generation now, maybe several generations, that communicate for the most part in epigrammatic, staccato, abbreviated ways where they don't even spell out sentences. They say, LOL, TTYL. Like they, they use these
Oh,
shorthands
good point.
that exist completely apart from the rules of grammar. I think there's been a vogue in education. I'm talking here about K through 12 education. There's been a vogue where you don't want to kind of discourage intellectual energy or retard ideas by submitting them to rules. So there's a sort of anything goes quality. We want to kind of reward the spirit and not kill it by giving it a whole bunch of rules to abide by. Well, that's fine, but at the end of the day, we need to communicate with one another. And all said, good writing is good writing. And I always say to my students, and I believe this fervently, if you take the time, if you show the humility to learn to write correctly and well, you may never be someone who's going to publish an op-ed or a book, but you're going to write business emails in your life. You're going to write maybe emails to neighbors. You're going to make pitches, et cetera, and so on. And there is no way that if you are someone who writes correctly and well and persuasively, there's no way that's not going to end up giving you an advantage in some circumstance at some point in time, if not in many circumstances. So just do it.
I want to shout out to my first editor, Mrs. Dennison, in the ninth grade, who made us diagram sentences, right up through David Vondrele, who you mentioned, Michael Duffy, Ruth Marcus. I've had the best editors in the world at the Post. Duffy once told me the problem with your writing, Hugh, is you say everything twice. Since he told me that, he's right.
We all do
It's just editors are fabulous when they're great, and David, of course, is fabulous. Have you read the book of Charlie yet? By the way,
I absolutely have. Yes, I loved it.
isn't it fabulous? I've told that story.
Yes. No,
It's a fabulous book. So I've had great editors. I'm just curious about whether or not colleges and high schools have given up. And my argument here, I don't know if you've read Henry Kissinger's last book, Leadership. The last chapter in that book is Henry's rather pessimistic view of where we're going. We are leaving the age of text and entering the age of image, and that where people used to read. And I gather you're the kind of reader that I was as a kid, always. I don't know that there are many of those kids left, Frank. Do you think there are?
There are some, but you're correct that another part of the puzzle here, in terms of why writing has degenerated and grammar has degenerated, is that the reading is not at the same level. The watching is at that level. Um, you can have a conversation with your students about what's streaming on Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu, et cetera, um, that is much more fruitful than what they've read. But it is a generalization. There are still readers out there. The book industry survives. Thank God. I'm knocking on my wood table. Um, but yeah, when students or anyone says to me, often readers will write into me and say, "I like the way you write. What's the best way to become a better writer?" I always say I'm going to give you the most boring but truest answer there is. Read and then read some more and then read some more after that, because it is not until you internalize the rhythms of good language that you can look at something you've written or be writing something and answer the question, does that sound good? The answer, you only answer the question, does that sound good? Is that written properly? That's only answerable if you have a storehouse of properly written, good sounding prose in your brain.
Frank, I want to go back to COVID because we agree on writing, so it's not interesting to talk about that. We just agree on it. I want to talk about COVID and what
But
it did to us.
we're disagreeing amicably about the things we're disagreeing
Yeah,
about,
that's
and
it.
I think that's
I want to talk to you about COVID because, like you, I wrote a Washington Post column on please put on the mask, bicyclists. I'm trying to do this running thing because I don't bicycle. I'm not coordinated enough to do anything except run or trundle now. I'm not fast enough to even call it running anymore. And early on, I said, please put on your mask. I have no idea about how far these droplets go, and I don't want to get this. And it was before the vaccine. My brother's a PhD toxicologist. He translated everything for me. I was where you were on the masks. And then I finally realized that everybody had been lying to us. I had Tony Fauci on this show 3 times. I had Dr. Collins on this show 3 times. Both men, lying is too strong. Both men misled me deeply about what they knew and didn't know about what was going on and what hadn't gone on. They shattered my confidence in public health to the point that I don't know that I will ever get it back. Because I have always got a bias towards intelligence, experience, education. I have a huge bias towards people like you who are very well educated, very good communicators who can make a case. They did that and they misled me. What do you think the consequences are of that, Frank?
Well, we know the answer to that. The trust in public health officials, the trust in experts, has declined. It's been declining. That's a story that precedes COVID, and a story that's bigger than COVID, but certainly some of what we were told early on in the pandemic has accelerated that. I want to say, just kind of for the cause of understanding, and in terms of, I do want us to be as generous as possible. Um, I think a lot of what we were told was the best guess at the time. Should it have been characterized, described a bit more as a guess than a matter of certainty? In retrospect, yes. But I don't think the intention was manipulative or evil, or certainly it wasn't evil. I think the idea was, this is our best guess. And if we don't state it with some degree of certainty, we're not going to change behavior in line with what our best guess really is. It would be good for all of us to remember that science isn't a eureka moment where everything becomes clear. It is a process by which you keep getting more information, you keep coming to more sophisticated conclusions, but it is an ongoing discovery. And I think that sometimes wasn't reflected or captured in some of the public discussions during the first part of the pandemic. Uh, there again, though, as you said, you wanted those bicyclists to mask. I put on that mask. I still don't understand why. I don't understand the pitch of the anger at the time, when many of us were just kind of erring on the side of caution and figuring, how much is this really asking of me? And if the best guess is that this is going to help the people around me or help me, if other people behave this way, why not do this? One more thing I'll say on this. Um, I do think the media should learn a lesson about dismissing certain things out of hand because they feel like they're politically inconvenient. The fact that everyone not just refused to write about or acknowledge, but mocked the lab leak hypothesis. That was mocked because the lab leak hypothesis or theory was seen as a kind of xenophobic thing. It was seen as something that might sanction prejudice. And so, for political reasons, it was shut down. And of course, over time, we've seen that it shouldn't have been shut down. And I think that's a lesson in not letting politics drive media coverage, but just kind of letting truth drive media coverage.
I would add to that the ivermectin debate, which is ongoing and remains a source of great controversy for people. Dr. Fauci's admission that he told people not to wear masks because he needed masks, a public lie made for a good purpose that subsequently came back to bite him. Most importantly, Frank, where I was misled, America did fund gain of function research at the Wuhan lab. We did that. We did that from the NIH. Both of those men denied it to me. They knew. I've subsequently seen the emails. They knew about it. And when you lie and you're a public health official, then we're never, I don't know what we do to, we've got to have public health authorities that people trust because the great influenza is going to come back. And this is not a one off. Any suggestions on how you rebuild trust in public health authorities?
I mean, you stop. I'm not, and when I say this, I'm not saying I agree that X person lied or this person lied and X, but I mean,
I get it.
you operate from a position of honesty henceforth. When you don't know, you say, I don't know. When you're giving someone your best guess, you say your best guess because credibility is everything. So you just start rebuilding your credibility by acting in a wholly credible fashion. I'd love to move on, but I just want to say one other thing. I am sure there are moments, and you mentioned one when Dr. Fauci was not at his best. I think his vilification, his demonization in some quarters, however, is unwarranted. The magnitude and intensity of it. I'm a gay man who was alive and covered journalistically and felt in the loss of friends around me the entire AIDS epidemic. And Dr. Fauci's service to America during those years, extraordinary. And I think if you look at his entire career, I think Dr. Fauci has, for the most part, been an estimable public servant. And I just kind of want to say that. Does it mean he's
Well,
perfect?
I
Does it
agree
mean,
with you, by the way, for the
okay,
most part.
all right.
And Dr. Collins is one of my heroes as as maybe one of the most effective Christian apologists of our era. But boy, they lost me not in terms of I fundamentally believe with C.S. Lewis, we've never met an ordinary human being. Everyone is either an immortal horror or an everlasting splendor, so everyone deserves dignity. And that's in the Weight of Glory essay. If you want to find that, it's a fabulous essay. And so I don't want to be too critical of the people I criticize. And certainly I've made so many mistakes. What did Napoleon say? I have erred so often that I no longer blush. I just have, and everyone should have that. But I do worry that they did inestimable damage, and I hope everyone left, right, and center listens to when you don't know, say so. And when you've made a mistake, own it. Frank, I want to make sure. I told you we'd go for an hour. We're almost up. Um, we need humility from our political leaders. We need humility from journalists. We need humility from activists, page 256. We need humility from ourselves, page 260. I think I was just saying that. I just don't think there's much financial upside to humility, Frank, and therefore everything is run by the market. The market includes monetization of extremism and overreaction, monetization of network playing to a niche. I had the lowest rated show in the history of MSNBC, so I speak from experience. You can't sell me to the MSNBC audience, even if they had tried and they didn't try very hard. I don't know how we ever get out of this, ever. I think we just got to learn to live with it.
Well, I mean, we can try to learn to live with it, but I think it's doing us inordinate damage. Um, I think this is something maybe when it comes to humility and the key of not believing you're always right, the key of feeling like you have the right to shut out other viewpoints. I mean, those sorts of problems. Maybe this kind of really begins in our private conversations, in our friend groups, in our private lives. Maybe we kind of begin to talk with one another and acknowledge these problems and resolve to behave with more decency and to treat people with more dignity and to behave with less zeal and certitude. Maybe that needs to be a private resolve. Um, I mean, I think we can try to kind of bring this into the classroom in some form. Especially, you talked about social media being such a pox. You and I agree entirely on this. I have found when you talk to students about their social media feeds, about the way they've set up their sort of information ecosystems, often it has happened in a sort of accidental way, and they end up in this very kind of sorted, narrow silo that they didn't actually set out trying to put themselves in. So they end up in this very unhumble place with these very unhumble perspectives, but it wasn't an intention, and it doesn't necessarily align with whom they understand they should be and whom they want to be. I wish in classrooms, at kitchen tables, on the soccer field, etc., we would talk more with young people about how they want to be informed, what they mean for their information to do for them, what kind of person they want to be, and how they set up and monitor their social media lives in an ongoing fashion to bring that into alignment with what they might agree would be their best self.
That is fine advice. I would end there, but for the fact I want to ask you, and you get a pass because my rule is I never ever critique my colleagues. All right, so I don't. You're not going to get me to critique Charlie Kirk on this show, and I don't expect you to critique the New York Times. But when I read the New York Times, and I read Ross Douthat, and I read David Brooks, and I read David French, and I read Brett Stevens, and I read Nick Kristof, who's been a guest on this show a dozen times if he's been on once, and I read them all. I don't see anyone who voted for Trump, not one. I think among my colleagues at the Washington Post, there might be 5 to 10% of the opinion writers who voted for Donald Trump. When I did the most recent debate, and I worked with Lester and Kristen and a wonderful team of about 40 people from NBC, I'm pretty sure I was the only pro-lifer. I'm absolutely sure I was the only pro-Trump, only person who voted for Trump twice in the room. Is that the root, the tap root of our division, that there is not representation of half the country in the elite media organs of the United States that produce the official narrative or the quasi-official narrative?
I don't know, and I'm obviously in an awkward place because I don't want to criticize the
And
Times.
don't.
And
I was just
yeah,
illustrating.
no, and I I would be genuine in kind of saying more good than bad about the Times. I admire the Times very much, while acknowledging that it has very many flaws. Um, I think it is an enormous problem. I think this is bigger than the elite legacy news organizations. I think it is an enormous problem that we live in an information age when, because of the internet, because of how easy it is to put something up on cable news, et cetera, because of this infinite buffet of options, people end up being able to choose only the food that they want. Um, and they believe that they're eating robustly when they're eating only the same thing over and over again. Either it's standing rib roast or it's broccoli. Either it's a hot fudge sundae or it's a piece of tofu, right? But they just, that's the only thing they see. And I think that the problem is we could get an MSNBC to put more diverse viewpoints on. We could get the New York Times to expand its roster of columnists. Most consumers will simply choose their news vessel and then choose what they do within that news vessel's universe according to what they want to hear and according to their search, not for information but affirmation. So I think this is a problem much bigger than the particular aspect of what the lineup of columnists are to give a news organization, or how diverse the newsroom is.
You
Consumers
did put into
have
the
some
age of
responsibility.
grievance the fact that most people do not know that news organizations can follow in a way they never have before how long people read a piece for, how many people click on it, how headlines get the response rate. And when you are subscription driven, that response rate drives everything. You put that in your book, and I'm glad you did. There, very few people are there. I want to
Well,
close, Frank,
and,
by go ahead.
well, I want people to take one thing away from that. You have more power to get the news to get news that reflects your principles than ever before. If you believe that you want to kind of read more diverse things, click on more diverse things. All of this is followed. All of this is tracked. And you can kind of create a news organization or a news environment better than the one you have by bringing your consumption patterns in line with your desires and values because it is all tracked and it is all responded to. Sorry.
Amen. That is the problem. And to the owners of these platforms, it doesn't immediately pay off, but it will in the long run if you put both sides on. I want to close with an uber meta narrative. I think the problem that we have in America is that we are easily offended. And I've been talking to Christian groups forever since I wrote in that space for a while. We choose to be offended, and taking offense is not a Christian value, it's not a virtue. We choose to be offended whenever we are offended. The frequency with which people are choosing to be offended has gone through the roof. You attended an anti racism seminar. Would you tell people about that, your experience, and whether or not those do any good or whether they work much harm?
I don't know whether, I'm sure they do some good. There's been studies that they also do great harm, and I go through this in the book. Um, I just found that there was a kind of reductiveness to that particular conversation that pained me. Racism is a real problem in our society. It goes back a long time and it has not magically gone away. Um, but when you kind of do anti racism seminars like the one that I went to, where they show you this hierarchy of oppression with who's most oppressed, who's next most oppressed, when you codify and classify it as if life is that reductive and simple, I think it rings false to many people. I think it makes many people feel defensive. I think it can shut down conversation as much as it does encourage it. And that's not the goal. I think it is a very blunt and imperfect instrument.
Frank, that is a good place on which to end. We do not like blunt and imperfect incidents, but I'm glad that the age of grievance is out there. We could go for 3 hours, but I told Frank just one. Frank Bruni, The Age of Grievance, wonderfully done. Thank you for joining me and have a good summer. Every professor loves the summer. I'm sure you do as well. Have a good one.
A good summer to you too.
Thank you, Frank.